Hello and welcome back to Talking Planning. I hope you're all doing well. So being back at home, I think many of us are starting to reminisce a little bit about some of our past travel and previous holidays. So with the Queensland Government altering those new restrictions last Sunday, being able to go out and about for local non-essential travel has been a real blessing, and it's welcome news. Of course, we do have one caveat in that, and that is we do have to stay within 50 kilometres of our home. So that puts things like flying off the cards for most of us. The relaxation of these restrictions is only possible due to the low case numbers we're currently experiencing. So unfortunately, those could be changed back at any time if we see a spike in cases. But at least it provides a little bit of a crumb of comfort that we may be able to travel a bit more freely soon. I know while I've been home, I've been thinking of new travel ideas because, let's be real, I'd rather be travelling too. Now, I'm sure that you've probably noticed, unless you've been living under a rock, that coronavirus has caused catastrophic, massive damage to travel and tourism industries. As our second largest airline, Virgin Australia, has recently entered voluntary administration with appointed by Deloitte, and many airlines are seeing a reduction in service, and in fact many airports are seeing a reduction in traffic, and in some cases completely closing down. Many regional airlines are now applying for government assistance, and several airlines have already gone under. Lufthansa is quoting that they're losing €5 million an hour. That's insane. That's incredible. That's so much money. It's ridiculous. Anyway, but as a keen traveller, this causes great sadness. Because, I'd rather also be travelling around the world myself too, embarking on new adventures. However, that's really not an option at the moment. So today, let's talk about some of the flow-on effects that's related to travel in some other industries, and in particular, what it actually means for our regional airports. This video, of course, is most relevant to the Australian airport landscape, but I'm sure that these challenges are experienced in many other countries around the world. So obviously, before I worked on the autonomous vehicle project, which I recently did a video on, which you'll be able to check out up there, I spent a year working as an airport planner in a specialist airport consultancy. During this time, I worked on a variety of airport master plans and advisory projects for clients. So I feel that I have a reasonable understanding, which will make this video a bit more interesting and a bit more informed about some of the challenges that are facing our airports. And this is important to remember because sadly, not all airlines and not all airports necessarily play fair. One of the big challenges with all of this is large airports typically tend to be a lot more financially buoyant and can actually ride out economic downturns much more easily than our smaller airports. Now for this video, when I'm referring to larger airports, I'm referring to an airport that typically handles over 1 million passengers per year. Characteristics of these airports are that they have a lot more financial stability with much higher access to capital. Typically in Australia, an airport of this size is almost exclusively privately funded. And one of the main people who invests in our larger airports are our superannuation funds. So our superannuation is much like how you have a retirement savings account, investment account, or 401k. It's where your employer makes contributions on your behalf in place of a pension later on in life. So typically these airports tend to be a medium risk investment with fairly solid returns. Of course there's risks of downturns like this, but you often find that airports do better more often than they do poorly, so they often tend to be quite a good investment, and superannuation funds tend to capitalise on that. I know my super fund is investing in 2 Australian major airports, so that's something I need to keep in mind. One of the reasons why our large airports are also popular is because they are high quality facilities. So the prices that are charged tend to be higher, but the users always end up with a fairly consistent product by and large. One of the benefits that our larger airports offer, in many cases, is ancillary facilities. They're not just for planes taking off and landing. They're often shopping malls, freight hubs, massive parking lots. One of the other things to keep in mind is individual airlines will sign private agreements with airports. That goes between small and large airports, but it's a big factor. So I can't comment on too many of those because they are, in most cases, completely private agreements. They're not able to be looked at by the general public, and those who are involved with them have to sign non-disclosure agreements before if they have to explain any details. One big thing to keep in mind though with large airports is the overheads. Yes, they have high overheads, but they're paid for by a large number of passengers through fees and charges that are on your individual ticket and through businesses. So in an airport, when they're paying rent, are helping to pay back the costs to operate all those ancillary features that an airport operates. So private renters in an airport are actually paying overheads for those airports, which makes them a lot more profitable. And the other benefit is, because these facilities are highly utilised, that actually reduces the cost that each passenger has to pay towards them. The big challenges is that because our large airports are seen as an essential service, and that they usually tend to deliver good returns, super funds and investment firms are quite happy to pour money into airports in most cases. However, our regional airports don't benefit from that luxury. So they tend to suffer a lot more and have much more limited options for finance. So most regional airports are quite cash strapped, let's be real. So since the 1990s in Australia, most regional airports have actually been funded by local governments, so your municipal councils or city councils. That means any bills that can't be passed on to travellers get absorbed by ratepayers, and that's covered by your property rates and property taxing and any form of water rates if they're maintained by a local council. One of the big challenges is it wasn't always like this. Up until the early 1990s, most regional airports were managed by the federal government, so they had a much larger funding base to draw off, but that's just not the case anymore. When we had a big change in aviation legislation, that went away. So there's also very limited appetite for private investment. And that makes it quite challenging to develop these facilities because there's very limited ways to actually get money to do all these projects. You've got to be a bit more creative, or things often slip through the cracks. So that means a lot of the facilities require some major work for maintenance. Maintenance jobs do unfortunately get put off in a lot of cases in regional airports due to the expense, and sometimes they're only done at the very end where they either have to be done or the airport kind of has to be shut. So things do get put off sometimes because of the prohibitive cost. And as that is the case, there's a real variation in the quality of facilities available. There are some really, really nicely built small airports that offer great facilities for passengers, and there are some that really struggle, that don't have the equipment that people expect these days and need. The other challenge with that is, because airports have to get that revenue to make that happen, one of the big things airports do, and this is public and private, is landing fees and charges. That's the main way that you get your actual aeronautical revenue. So we'll often find with a lot of regional airports, they're charging too little to itinerant customers, that is people who arrive at that airport occasionally. And when that happens, that means that the airport's not able to gain a sufficient amount of revenue to pay a lot of those costs, and many of them are incurred by taxpayers, or ratepayers I should say. Occasionally we also find that some airports are just too expensive. Because the price is so high, people are avoiding using them and are choosing to try to fly into a further away airport and actually hire a vehicle because it works out cheaper, and they're actually losing revenue because they have too fewer customers. In some cases, you also have too many regional airports too close together, and that sort of puts competition and means that some of the smaller ones lose out and one larger regional airport takes the monopoly of, aircraft landings. This is further compounded because nowadays there's limited federal support, and the support that each state government's willing to put in place is very limited as well. And I guess then the two largest alternate issues as well are a big airport, Brisbane Airport or Sydney Airport, or have ancillary businesses which make money for the airport. So particularly with Brisbane, we've got a major shopping mall called DFO, that's on airport land. they get to lease that space out and have a fairly good range of retail services that are available even if there's a downturn in aircraft arrivals and departures. So regional airports tend not to have that as an option in their sort of current design. And then the final one is regional airports still have overheads, they still have an operating cost, and it's not always proportionate to the number of passengers. In many cases, those operating costs are somewhat fixed. And because of that, because there's less passengers and less retailers involved, they have to pay a much higher cost per passenger to use the same facilities that all airports are actually required to have. So obviously our fixed costs are often lower for smaller airports, but they're far from proportionate. And when I'm talking proportionate, what I mean is dollars of cost incurred per passenger using those facilities. So the most obvious one is security. Australia is going through a bit of a renaissance in terms of reform to security legislation right now, and that's leading to massive increases in cost for security as we're requiring much higher standards. There are small regional airports that it's unclear that at the current point in time, they actually don't require screening services. However, it's unclear what changes are apparent or are likely for those facilities. Some of the smaller airports which already require basic security will now require much more complex things like full-size body scanners rather than just metal detectors. And then our larger airports are still required to upgrade security to meet those requirements as well. So the big thing is the cost to buy that equipment. Even a basic body scanner is pretty much at least $1 million to buy. And then you've got annual maintenance, and that certainly adds up. And particularly if you've got lots of equipment you have to put in place, construction work is sometimes required to actually contain all that. So you actually have to extend your terminals and make your area a lot larger for passengers just to fit security equipment. Now, Brisbane Airport did a preliminary estimate a couple of years ago with the new legislation that was proposed, and their cost estimate came to $330 million to upgrade Brisbane Airport to suit the new security requirements. Now, Brisbane handles around 25 million passengers a year. So if you divide $330 million by 25 million passengers, and that would be $13 per passenger to pay for those costs. Now, let's look at a little regional airport. Let's say they're required to get the same body scanners. They might get one instead of maybe 3 or 4. Now, cost estimates for those facilities might be $5 to $10 million to buy one set of scanners and to extend the space to make sure that you can actually fit all the security. Now, I'd say at $10 million, you've got an airport with 100,000 passengers a year. That's going to be $100 per passenger. So in terms of those fixed costs, that's far higher than it would be for a much larger airport. So it's far from being proportionate. Then, of course, you've got the costs for personnel. You've got to have your staff to run that. They are variable, but they're still expenses. They're quite high and need to be kept in mind. Then you've got the usuals, runway maintenance, which is certainly expensive, and taxiways. Terminal and building maintenance is very expensive as well. These costs don't just disappear because you've got a small airport. They're still there and they're still quite high. The next one I'm going to bring to is acute cost. Common user terminal equipment, or abbreviated to CUTE. So these are your check-in desks and boarding counters, and basically the equipment that each airline is required to use to do all the check-in procedures and prepare for boarding. So this equipment in most cases is not owned by an airline, it's owned by the airport and it's leased out to each operator as they need it. Then of course you've just got the basics such as maintenance and cleaning and electricity, water and utilities. So a lot of these regional airports are designated as providing essential services, which sounds fantastic, but it's often got a catch-22 involved with that. So airports cater to essential services. Those essential service flights, which are sort of regional connecting flights, rarely follow those published landing fees and charges structures. So if an airport charges an itinerant customer, so that's usually a private aircraft landing in a facility, let's say they charge them $10 per tonne for that aircraft. They've got a 10-tonne aircraft, that's $100 for landing fee. The airlines tend not to use those same agreements. They tend to sign their own commercial agreement, which is typically in the airline's favour. And that's done through obviously private means and non-disclosure agreements. So the vast majority of people will be completely unable to find out what those airlines are actually charging. These agreements usually do increase passenger numbers at those airports, but unfortunately it's often at a loss as well. So whilst they're getting more and more people through the doors, it often means that it's actually costing them to do that. And unfortunately, in many cases, airlines hold the high ground with these facilities. So if an airline is concerned about their profitability, they often manage to underwrite that, and if they're not happy with their own, sometimes they'll go and get an underwritten agreement directly from a government department, but in many other cases, they'll actively seek ways to make their service more profitable. The airline will often threaten to cancel a service in the hope that the airport will actually reduce the landing fees for that service. And unfortunately, it works. Airports are often scared to lose customers, and that means that sometimes at the risk of their own financial survival, an airport will reduce landing fees for a client just to make sure that they stay and don't cancel their service, even if it's costing them money to do that. The other thing to keep in mind is each arrangement for essential air services is different, but what often happens in Australia is individual airlines will tender for an essential services contract, and once they've done that, if they're the successful tenderer, they then will separately negotiate deals with the airports. So they're getting their payment from the government to operate that service, but then on top of that, they'll negotiate with each airport along those service routes to try and get cheaper landing fees as part of that as well. Larger airports is to diversify their airport land use and to diversify their revenue base and cost bases. So one of the things that we could always look at is something that's a little bit cliche. It's very, very popular with airports, and that is the business park. So what a lot of airports will consider doing is if they've got extra land on their facilities that they're not using for aviation purposes or can't use for aviation purposes, as long as it's not interfering with aeronautical safety, they'll rezone that land for another purpose. One of the big ones that is used is the business park. So it's for offices and small warehouses and small new tenants and clients who will pay regular rent, and those facilities are often unaffected or only slightly affected by a drop in aviation revenue. So that will still be regular revenue coming in that helps secure the financial basis of that airport. The other thing which is available as an option is the aero park, so an aircraft-centric development. So you're used to in suburbia going for a walk, you go down the street, there's lots of cars around, it's very car-centric. Think of suburbia, but instead of roads, it's taxiways. You've got little aircraft, hobby, aviation enthusiasts. The only challenge with that is they've got a very limited market. So they're really cool, and there are certain people who would absolutely love to live in an aero park. However, it's a fairly small customer base of people that are really that interested in it. So it's something that's not particularly common, but a few airports do it. Another economic model to consider are on-site shopping malls. Brisbane Airport Corporation has done it very successfully with DFO. They've created a large format retail centre, and there's lots of shopping available, and many people just go to that shopping centre rather than just going to the airport. So initially it was of course conceived that people maybe while waiting to pick up people would go for a shop, but people now are just going to go shopping, and it works out as a really good alternative revenue stream for the airport. The other option, of course, is freight distribution. Airports, particularly our larger airports, do accept international and domestic freight deliveries, and that works really well. So having courier companies, for example, and post offices basing their distribution centres at airports makes a lot of sense. It reduces travel time, it increases speed, and it's often a very effective way of working. It's important to keep in mind that these have actually worked really effectively in our large cities, but it can be really challenging to scale this down for our regional areas. So what else can we do to help our regional airports? Well, one of the first things we can look at is how we can reduce our financial burden on local governments and our ratepayers. There's lots of different schemes that could be done to do that. One is to have a good look at your fees and charges you're charging for an airport and see if they are getting closer to covering those costs. Another thing that's really important is to encourage airlines and airports to reach much fairer commercial agreements. The fact that so many of these are skewed just in an airline's favour means that it's very difficult for a lot of regional airports who now have a very limited income stream, because in some of these agreements, it's actually a case where an airport is taking collecting no landing fees or charges from serviced airlines that are providing essential service. Again, diversifying services of aircraft is really important, so to cover passenger and freight movements. And one of the big ones, particularly now that we're talking about increased security, is helping to subsidise those costs. There's been talk of subsidies coming, however, there's not necessarily been clear directions on how these are going to work and who's going to receive subsidies. And to be fair, we're at a point where we don't even know who's going to require increased security. Because some really, really small regional airports, which only have a couple thousand passengers a year and operate very small aircraft, may now require security. And if that's the case, that's a massive financial burden on such a small facility. I think another final key point is to actually encourage airports to be proactive in developing master plans and responding to new economic opportunities. That's what my last role really was. We worked on airport master plans, mostly in regional airports. And we find if you've got those clear goals in place and you can actually help that economic case work well, airports respond much better in times of downturn. They're able to actually maintain passenger numbers in a lot of cases, or if that's not possible, at least maintain financial viability by working with new assets and looking at new development options, which could prove really vital for the buoyancy and strength of those airports. I think that the coronavirus challenge provides a good opportunity to actually reset and reconsider the way that we view regional aviation. But to do that, it requires action from local, state and federal governments, as well as airport operators and airlines. So our larger airports really do benefit from increased diversification and investment. And that is helping them ride out downturns quite well. But sadly, our regional airports don't seem to have those same benefits. So I think it's a really important time to actually have a good look at how we address regional aviation, and especially in a country like Australia where we rely so heavily on it. There is a lot of improvement that could be made, and I think there are a lot of opportunities in that, particularly to provide better outcomes for our small regional airports and our regional communities, which matter so dearly to this country. So I'd like to say once again, thank you for joining me on Talking Planning. So you can, as always, stay up to date with all my latest adventures with Talking Planning on Instagram and Twitter for your updates. That's where I post information about new video releases and talk about some new updates in my life as a planner. So of course, as always, if you've got any questions or suggestions for future videos, pop them in the comments below and I'll see if I can make something about that too. And as always, I'd really appreciate if you could subscribe to this video, like it and ring that notification bell if you want to keep up to date with new topics. So now more than ever is an important time to be talking planning and to be talking flying, because everything depends on it.